Hello, Britlet. This is the discussion for chapters 28 and 29. Okay, you should have turned those questions in to turn it in by midnight on Tuesday, April 21st. And so you should be listening to this on Wednesday, April 22nd. Okay, so in these two chapters, we've got Jane trying to figure out what she's going to do now that she has left Thornfield, right? Remember that she had, at the end of chapter 27, she had gotten onto a coach, which was kind of like, it would have been a closed carriage that you could just pay money to go a certain way. So it would kind of be like the equivalent of, I guess, like a Greyhound bus or something. You know, they would have certain routes they would run. And so she just was taking this bus or coach to nowhere, basically. She didn't know where she was going. And the bad thing is she didn't have 30 shillings for the trip. She only had 20. So he just put her off at this crossroads, which I thought was kind of harsh. But he said that was as far as he could take her for 20 shillings. So he puts her out at literally just a crossroad. Like, it's where two roads meet. You know, of course, these all would be dirt roads and stuff back then. There's nothing anywhere for miles around. There's just like a white cross, which is why it's called Whit Cross. And so she's trying to figure out what she's going to do, because she can't just stand there next to the signpost. So she decides that night she is going to just sleep out in the wild. At least it is a pleasant night. Remember, it's summer, or she would have been in even worse shape. And there was some, she found like a granite crag that was kind of like sticking up out of the earth, so she could kind of like get up against it. You know what I mean? So she wasn't just like out in the open. And the moss was very thick, and so she picked a few berries and stuff and laid down to sleep. And she was, of course, her heart was still hurting because she felt so bad about leaving Rochester, and she didn't want him to, degenerate or make bad choices or anything. But it did help her looking up at the night sky. I thought this was cool how she said, after she said that night were come, she said, "We know that God is everywhere, but certainly we feel His presence most when His works are on the grandest scale spread before us. And it is in the unclouded night sky, where His worlds wheel their silent course, that we read clearest His infinitude, His omnipotence, His omnipresence." And so just looking up at the sky reminds her that God is there and He's with her. So what she realized right at the beginning of the chapter was that she had left her parcel in the coach, unfortunately, when she got out of the coach. So she didn't have much, but she had packed a few things, at least like a change of clothes, and I think there was like a brooch, or something like that. She didn't have any more money, but I mean, she at least did have some stuff. But she left all that on the coach, so that's gone now. So that's even worse because she doesn't even have anything she can try to sell or trade. So the next morning she wakes up and she knows she's got to get moving. For one thing, she's really hungry. She's gone through all of the food. She only had berries for supper, basically. And so she had a little bit of bread, but that was about it. So she's really hungry. So she knows she's got to get moving. So she gets up and thinks to herself, man, I kind of wish I could have just died right there, which is a very depressing thought. But she's just not looking forward to whatever hardship she knows is coming before she can figure out what she's going to do with herself. And she's scared. She's alone. I mean, she's around y'all's age, and she's out in the middle of nowhere, just this female, on her own. And so she just doesn't know what she's going to do. But she's walking and walking and walking. And eventually she hears a bell. And so she knows that that's a church bell. And so she realizes she must be near a town. So she walks towards that. And so she goes into this little village about 2 o'clock. And there was a little shop that had bread in the window. And so she wants to go in there and see if she can trade her gloves or her handkerchief for bread. But she was too embarrassed to ask. I mean, she hasn't been brought up to beg. She's been brought up to provide for herself. And just the idea of, she walks in and the lady can tell she's dressed like a lady, and so she's like, "Yes, may I help you?" And she just can't come up with a way to say "Hey, will you take these gloves for some food?" That would be so awkward. So she leaves and kind of wanders around. She does ask the lady at the shop, what do people do here for employment? Does anybody need a maid? She's just trying to find some way to provide for herself. And the lady's not super helpful at all. And so she's just kind of like wandering around. There was a really pretty little house that she stops at, this real pretty little cottage, and there's a nice lady who answers it, but when she asked, do they need a servant, she said no, and the lady said, she asked, is there anybody nearby who needs anybody, and she said she didn't know, she was sorry, she couldn't give her any information, and then closed the door on her. And so she's just kind of wandering around. She's really, really hungry. She's getting pretty weak from hunger at this point because it's getting, kind of late. And so she remembers that, that people supposedly can go to the church if they have trouble. And that's true. I don't know, if you're not aware of that, that is true. My stepdad is a preacher, and there were quite a few times where people would just kind of show up, passing through town, needing bus fare to the next place or trying to get somewhere. And so people do go to churches even in today's time to ask for help. So she goes to the parsonage, which is where the preacher lives near the church, and an old woman who's obviously a servant opens, but the preacher is not home. He's gone to Marsh End and will probably be gone like 2 weeks. And so no, the housekeeper can't help her, so she just heads on off again. So she goes back to the little shop. She's so hungry now, she's willing to swallow her pride, and she asks, will you give me some bread for a handkerchief or for the gloves? And the lady's like, no, why? Well, what would I do with that? Which definitely seems mean on the lady's part. But when you think about it, that would be like if you went into, McDonald's and tried to give them your phone case for a hamburger. Like, they can't do that, So anyway, she's still just kind of wandering around. And she comes across this farmhouse with a farmer sitting outside eating bread and cheese. And she asks him if she can have some bread, and he gives her some, so she finally gets that at least. And so once again it is night, and she's kind of just sleeping out, but this time it's wet. It's raining. She keeps feeling like she hears people nearby, and she doesn't want to be, attacked or raped or anything, so she keeps moving throughout the night. So the next morning she's wet, she's starving, and she sees this little girl who's going to throw some porridge into a pig trough. Of course, that's like oatmeal, some cold oatmeal into the pig trough, and she asks if she can have it. And so the little girl asks her mother, and her mom says, sure, the pig doesn't want it. And so she gives it to her, which, I know she's starving, and at this point she would probably eat pretty much anything, but have you ever scraped like cold, kind of hardened oatmeal out of the pan? Anyway. So she's heading on out of town because she knows she hasn't been able to find any help in town, and she's like, I don't want to just die in the street. You know what I mean? Like, that would be horribly humiliating. Don't want to die in the street and be put in some kind of beggar's grave. I'd rather be out on the wild moors, out in the woods, and just let my body return to the earth rather than that. And so she's just moving on. It's getting darker and darker. It is very dangerous for her to be doing that because where she is, it's like the moors, which is kind of like a marshy land. So, I mean, she could fall into a marsh and, be gone at that point. But I don't know if she do much cares by this point. So, anyway, she is traveling over the moors, and let's see where she says this. I want to find a particular line here. Okay, she says her strength is failing her and she can't go much further, and she says, why do I struggle to retain a valueless life? And then she prays. She says, oh Providence. So basically she's praying to God. She says, sustain me a little longer, aid, direct me. So I want you to be aware that that's what happened first. She prays, and then as she gets over the hill, she sees a light, right? And she can't tell exactly what it is, but there's some kind of light. And so she starts walking towards it for lack of anything better to do. And then eventually she comes up on this little cottage, and it's kind of got, it's kind of low, kind of built down into the earthen part of it, so she can kind of like bend down at the window and see down into the room. And so she kind of just sits there and looks down into the room, and it's such a pleasant, homey scene that she almost forgets the fact that she is freezing and wet because it's storming, and cold and hungry, and, you know, just kind of like gazes in at this scene that's so peaceful and so comforting looking, and she's just absorbed by it. So what she sees in this window is two young ladies, two graceful young ladies, and a big, large pointer dog, which is like a bird dog, and a cat, also in there, and then there's an older lady who's in there with them as well. And so, you know, we're on this one. We answered that about the bread from the farmer and the oatmeal from the girl. So, she sees these two young girls and then this older lady who appears to be a servant, and they are translating. And so they're sitting there and reading and translating something into German and just kind of talking about that with each other. And the older lady, they appear to be, some kind of teachers, because they say that, you know, once they learn it, it will be, and, you know, it'll be better for them. They might be able to get more money than they do now. And so, they are getting ready to go up and go to bed, and Jane hears the lady talking about how it's lonesome to go into this other room. And so obviously they're all talking about someone who has died, and Hannah, who is the servant, says he's in a better place and he had a very quiet death. He had just, you know, wasn't really feeling good, but then the next day when St. John, and I know it looks like St. John, but it's pronounced St. John. So the next day when St. John went to check on him, he had gone. He was passed. And so she's getting ready to leave, and Jane realizes, okay, I got to try to get their attention. So she goes and knocks on the door, and Hannah's the one who opens it. She's the old servant. And so Hannah opens the door and is very suspicious. She says, "What do you want?" in a tone of surprise. Because, I mean, it's dark, you know. I mean, if somebody knocked on your door late at night, you would expect it to be somebody you know. You know what I mean? Not some stranger who is soaked to the skin. And so Jane asked, "Can I speak to your mistresses?" And she said, "No, you can talk to me." And she asked, "What's her business here?" She's very suspicious. She said she's heard that there have been some people around. And I thought it was weird that this was happening even back in this time, because you hear about it happening in today's time, that they'll send, you know, like robbers or people who are going to break into houses or whatever will send like a child or a woman to the door first, because you're more likely to open the door. And then they'll bust in on you and rob you blind. And so that's what Hannah is scared is happening. And so she says that she's got to move off, and, you know, gives her a penny. And Jane's like, "What am I supposed to do with that? I'm starving. I can't go any further." And she keeps asking to see the young ladies, and Hannah won't let them, and she tells them to move off. So she shuts the door on her and bolts it. And Jane just cries. She just sinks down on the doorstep and cries. She's like, "Well, this is it. This is as far as I can go." I mean, she's so weak at this point and has had so little to eat or drink that she is, and, you know, she was always very thin anyway. It's not like she's, you know, the type of person who would last a while. So she says out loud, "I can but die, and I believe in God. Let me try to wait His will in silence." So basically she just resigns herself to, well, I guess I'm dying here on this doorstep, you know. But then all of a sudden she hears a voice say, "All men must die, but all are not condemned to meet a lingering and premature doom, such as yours would be if you perished here of want." And she's terrified. She's like, "Who's that?" And so the man knocks at the door, and Hannah cries out, "Is that you, Mr. St. John?" And he said, "Yes, open it quickly." And Hannah's like, "Oh, good, I was scared. There's been a beggar woman." "Oh, she's still here." You know, Hannah's still scared. And St. John said, "It's fine. You know, we're going to let her in." And Hannah didn't want to, but St. John insisted. And so they bring her inside, and Diana and Mary are very concerned for her. She's extremely thin and very white, like she's lost almost all color in her face. And so St. John tells Hannah to get him some bread and milk, and dips milk in the bread and feeds her. And so he gives her just a little bit. He doesn't let her have too much. I don't know if you've ever heard those stories, but like when they first went in and rescued people who had been kept in concentration camps, I know you've seen the pictures, like they were so horribly thin because they'd been starved. and trying to be kind, the soldiers gave them their food, like gave them a bunch of food, but it'll kill you. Like if you've been subsisting on almost nothing and then you eat like a normal amount of food for a human, your body can't handle it. And so luckily St. John knows that, and he doesn't let her eat very much. And so they try to ask her, who she is and what she wants. She says her name. So St. John is the one who let her enter the house. And she says her name, remember, is Jane Elliott. So she has decided to take a pseudonym, so that, hopefully Rochester won't be able to track her down. And so she's too weak to really answer many questions. And so she says she'll trust in them to do with her, what they will. And so St. John and Diana and Mary go and discuss it. And then after a while, they take her upstairs. And Hannah helps her to remove her wet clothes and put her into a warm, dry bed. And she is so thankful. I mean, after having gone through all that, to finally be dry and warm and have some food on her stomach, she falls into a deep sleep. So that's the end of that chapter. It was a long, harrowing experience for her, but as the chapter ends, she's safe, she's warm, she's fed, she's in this house. These people are strangers, but they seem kind. So that's how the chapter ends. So, the next chapter, chapter 29, she is sick for like 3 or 4 days. Just like, not, really doesn't even hardly come to consciousness. Like, I don't know if you've ever been that ill. I have one time when I had the flu really bad. Like, I didn't even know how many days had passed. I was so sick and running a high fever. And so that's how she is. She's feverish. She's very, very ill. They come in and take care of her. And give her some broth ever so often and stuff like that. And she eventually gets better. St. John doesn't call for the doctor because he says he can tell she's just been strained. Her nerves are shot. She's been strained past what her body can handle, and it just needs to rest and recuperate. So she does. And they're thinking she's probably just somebody who's had a fight with her family or friends and got lost her way, and, they'll be able to help her get back home. But on the 4th day, she's finally able to get up, and she sees that Hannah has cleaned her clothes, and that they're laid out for her, and so she gets herself dressed, and they hang on her. She's so thin now, but she gets herself dressed and goes downstairs to the kitchen where Hannah is. Hannah's the only one in the house. And so she starts kind of questioning Hannah. Well, Hannah questions her, and then she questions Hannah. Because Hannah's trying to figure out why this person who seems like a lady, in other words, what she means by that is that Jane has good manners, and she's obviously well educated because of the way she speaks. And so she doesn't understand why she would have turned into a beggar. And Jane's basically don't worry about it. And she says, well, you sound educated. And she says, yes, I've been to a boarding school. And she said, why can't you keep yourself then? And she says, well, I have, and I hope to again. And so then she starts asking Hannah questions, and we find out a little bit more about where she is, like the name of the house. It actually has 2 names. Hannah says that some people call it Marsh End, and some people call it Moore House. So, both of the names have to do with where it's located. It's on the marsh, right at the edge of the moors, in a very kind of desolate region. And so Jane asks Hannah, she says, the gentleman who lives here is called Mr. St. John. And Hannah says, well, he doesn't live here. This was his dad's house. He is a parson. He lives a few miles off at the village. So we connect the dots here. Remember how Jane went to the parsonage looking for the preacher to ask for help? And the housekeeper there said that he was gone for like 2 weeks because his father had died. That's St. John. So that's why he wasn't home. He was here. So she just, happily wound up, still finding the preacher, just through her prayer. And so she talks about how old Mr. Rivers has passed away, and that St. John and Diana and Mary are brother and sisters, and that their father died from a stroke, and their mother has been dead for a long, long time. And Hannah was the nanny or the nursemaid to all 3 children when they were young. She's been with the family over 30 years. And so Jane kind of gets onto her for calling her a beggar, and for treating her so badly. She said, you know, even if I don't have any money, Jesus didn't have money either, you know, and you shouldn't blame somebody for that. And so Hannah apologizes and says, you know, she was just trying to be careful about the young girls. And so St. John, of course, she says, is a parson, and the girls are governesses. So just like Jane had been, they're governesses in town. None of them live at the house. Like, it had just been Hannah and old Mr. Rivers, but you know, they're all home because their dad's funeral has just happened. So that's why they even happened to be there. And so Diana and Mary come in from a walk and see that she's there, and they're kind of fussing over her, like, oh, you should have waited for us to help you, and don't sit in the kitchen, it's too hot, you need to come in here. And so she goes in there where St. John is, and when the sisters come in too, they're all kind of eating some tea, and drinking tea and eating, you know, some little snacks and stuff, which fortifies Jane. And they start questioning her. And he says, you know, what's the residence of your friends? We can write to them and get you back home. And she's like, well, I don't have any friends. I don't have any home. I don't have any tie to any living thing. Nor do I claim that I could possess admittance under any roof in England. And so he's like, that's weird. You've never been married. You're a spinster. And Dinah laughs. She's like, she's not old enough to be a spinster, you know. And so she says she's almost 19, but she's not married. And so they're just kind of asking a bunch of questions. And she says she needs help. She wants to get good, honest work if they can help her. She tells them, she says, I'll tell you as much of my story as I can. I can't tell you everything because it would put me or others in danger, but I'll tell you as much as I can. And so she says she's an orphan, the daughter of a clergyman, and her parents died before she knew them, and was brought up as a dependent and then sent away to a charitable institution. She tells them it was Lowood, which Mr. Rivers has heard of. And she said, I left Lowood nearly a year ago to become a private governess, and I was very happy. It was a good situation. But 4 days ago, I had to leave. It wasn't my fault. I was blameless, but I had to get out of there as soon as I could. And so now I've just got to try to find some other way to live. And she tells them how she left her parcel on the coach and all that. And so Diana says, don't make her talk anymore, St. John. She's still very weak. She says, come to the sofa and sit down now, Miss Elliot. And so Jane kind of like jumps when she hears Miss Elliot. And St. John said, you did say that was your name, didn't you? So he can tell, you know, that something was wrong. And she says, yes, I did, but it's not my real name. It's just the name that I have to go by right now. And he says, you won't give us your real name? And she said, no, I fear discovery above all things. And so I have to avoid that. And so the sisters basically kind of tell St. John to quit picking on her. And she says that Diana and Mary both say she's going to stay there. And St. John said he's a very poor parson, so there's not a whole lot he can do. But if she is, you know, willing to take what little help he can, he'll try to find her some kind of situation. And she says, you know, absolutely, as long as it's honest work, she'll do whatever she can. And so then by that point, she is, you know, kind of worn out and winds up going back upstairs. So she describes St. John as being very good looking. He's very handsome, very classic, like Grecian profile. His character seems kind of, I don't want to say cold. It's not like he's mean. He's just kind of like, seems to be sort of distant a little bit. Like Mary and Diana seem very caring towards her. And it's not that he seems uncaring, but he's just seems to be more reserved. You know, I mean, he kind of seems like he's just sort of watching and withholding judgment. But he does say he'll help her and that she should stay with them until she regains her strength. So, you know, that's good, which you would expect. You know, you would hope a preacher would be nice. Okay, so that's the end of that.